stage. I forget if I did it or not. So I'm going to do it in front of you, and now I'm sure that the sound is off. Well, welcome everyone to Jefferson County's 8th annual community read, centered this year on the special book, The Tricking the Freya, by Christina Sunley. Christina was born in New York City, raised on Long Island, and has lived for the past 20 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. And she's quite enjoying our little town. She attended Wesleyan, and I really don't know how to say that. Wesleyan, okay, Wesleyan University, earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Film from New York University and a master's degree in English and Creative Writing from San Francisco State University. She currently works as a grant writer for a food bank program in San Francisco that feeds 200,000 people a week. Christina will be glad to answer questions after her presentation, and then she will also autograph books, and we intend to sit her there by the door to autograph books. We want to thank the people who made this program possible. Our primary sponsors are the Jefferson County Library District and the late Adela Rodriguez, who love this library and programs that help people connect with and understand each other. We are going to miss her. The hardworking members of the Community Read Committee are wearing these name tags, or supposed to be wearing them. And every single person in the Jefferson County Library staff has been vitally important. Thank you. Last night, we video traveled through Iceland with commentary from Christina. This morning, she presented a dynamic workshop for local writers, and I see many of them here. Please welcome author Christina Sunley, and let's hear how she fell in love with Iceland.
Well, I would like to thank, first of all, Ruth Ann, who has been just a wonderful host for me in your community here. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. And especially everybody in the Community Reads program, Steve and Bill and Gil and Phyllis and everybody else who's been involved in bringing me here. Tonight I'm going to tell you a bit about the epic journey that I went on to write this book, which some of you have read and some haven't. I'll do a little bit of reading from the novel and show some images and photos of my trips to Iceland and things that influenced the writing of the book. I call this talk How I Fell in Love with Iceland because even though Iceland was always in the background of my family history, it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s that I became fairly suddenly and intensely fascinated with Iceland. Its landscape, geography, history, literature, culture, language, and people. And it was a lot like falling in love, except it was with a country rather than a person. I'm going to start by reading to you a section from the book. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I'll tell you a little bit about what it's about. It tells the story of a young American woman, whose name is Freya, whose grandparents are Icelandic. She grows up in the U.S. in the 1970s, but spends her summers in Gimli, Canada, where the Icelandic immigrants settled in the 19th century. In Gimli, Freya spends time with her mother's sister, her Aunt Ingibjörg, called Birdie, who teaches Freya about Icelandic culture and language. Birdie is charming and talented, but also mentally ill. She involves Freya in a series of tragedies and dramas throughout the book. Later, when Freya is 30 in the 1990s, she discovers a family secret about Birdie that takes her back to Gimli and then to Iceland itself. The quest to answer this mystery also becomes Freya's quest to come to terms with the past and her Icelandic heritage. The section that I'm going to read from is when Freya is 13 and she has arrived in Iceland with her Aunt Birdie for the very first time, and they're touring the countryside with Birdie's Icelandic friend, whose name is Ulfur. I chose this section to read because I feel it expresses how much awe and wonder I myself had when I came to Iceland for the first time. This is the section that I read aloud on my Icelandic book tour last year, in Icelandic, which I was very nervous about, and I practiced endlessly. So I practically memorized all this passage, and then and reading it aloud to audiences in Iceland. And then as we traveled around Iceland, the phrases from my book just kept floating through my head because it was just exactly the same landscape that I had written about. So I'm going to read you that section now. Freya is 13 years old, and it's in her voice. And the photographs are photos that my husband Oliver took as we went on our road trip. Nothing, not even Bertie's magical spiel on the airplane, could have prepared me for what lay beyond Reykjavik. Iceland is land alive, the earth split open, forming and reforming before your eyes. Vast vistas of swirling black and neon green, moss-drenched lavascapes. Volcanoes in all directions and at every stage of existence. Smoldering, dormant, extinct. Glaciers on the move, their hoary tongues licking the edges of meadows. Water falling everywhere, trickling, spilling, clamoring, rumbling down rocky crevices and canyons. And spitting up, boiling hot from holes in the ground. And I tell you, this is just a place that is off the side of the road as you drive along the main highway. Meandering through this riot of lava and ice and emerald slopes, as if it were the most ordinary scenery in the world. Wild horses, stout-bellied and thick-maned, peering out from behind fringed bangs. And the ubiquitous sheep with their spiraling horns and shaggy dreadlocked coats. We're outnumbered, Bertie would say, when we round a bend and confront 6 sheep napping in the roadway. By this, she meant the fact that there are more sheep than people in Iceland, far more. Everywhere you go, it's sheep a graze, munching grass on top of turf-roofed ruins, nipping at odd bits of growth in barren lava fields, hoofing it up the rocky bank of a waterfall. We let them roam free, Oliver explained, and this is why they taste so good. The lava moss gives them a particular flavor, so we give our sheep the run of the island. I wanted the run of the island. I'd never seen nature so wild. I was used to the timid rolling hills of Connecticut, the flat, scrubby shore of Lake Winnipeg, forests. In Iceland, there are no trees to speak of. Trees get in the way, Oliver explained. They block the view. Trees can't grow in Iceland. That's the truth of it. Little does. But I could grow there. I felt myself expanding. For the first time since Mama's accident, I had no dutiful routines, no canes to keep track of, no Mama to tend. It freed and it terrified. I began wearing my hair pulled back. The wind made me do it. In Iceland, it never stops blowing. And at first, I felt barefaced. Then Bertie touched her fingertips to my cheekbones. "You're a beauty," she told me. Me? A beauty? I shook my head laughing. But during those days at Oliver's summer house, I allowed myself to believe it, or at least to consider the possibility. The landscape itself emboldened me. I spoke up more, dropped my shield of shyness and silence. I began to speak only Icelandic, then to think and even dream in it. And this slide, for those of you who have read the book, this slide is the place called Thingvellir, which is where the original Icelandic settlers, the pagans, held their annual parliament. And it's also a place where there's a very dramatic scene in my book with Bertie and Freya and Bus. And you can see all of that there, and what a remote and lonely, stark but beautiful place that is. So how did I come to have a book tour in Iceland, and how did I even get interested want to tell you a bit about what I call the 8-year saga of the writing of the Tricking of Freya. And I should mention that saga is one of the few Icelandic words that has made it into the English language, along with geyser. And saga means story or history. I often say that the Tricking of Freya was inspired by my family history. And I've felt for many years now that I'm living under the influence of my ancestors. This is my grandmother, who I never met. She died shortly after this photograph was taken. But I had a dream once that she was pushing words out through my fingers in a stream of light. From my earliest memories, my mother was telling me stories about our Icelandic relatives in Canada and our ancestors in Iceland. This seemed very odd to me growing up in New York. I'm not sure I believed Iceland really existed. My mother was born in the West End, the Icelandic neighborhood of Winnipeg, Manitoba, where everyone spoke Icelandic. They had Icelandic churches and schools and businesses, though of course they spoke English as well. My mother had very happy memories of this community, where Icelanders were called ghoulies. But then a tragedy happened. Her parents died and she was sent to live in the US. And I believe that my mother never really got over this loss, the death of her parents and being taken from her Icelandic world in Winnipeg. And I believe that that's why she missed them and told so many stories about them to me as a child. And these stories had a need in them, a sadness and a longing that had a great effect on me. Sometimes I say that the Tricking of Freya began in one image that has haunted me all my life, the story of how my grandfather and his family lived through the Askja volcanic eruption in 1875 and its terrible ash fall. My mother often told me this story as a child. It's funny, but when I was first researching my book, I was looking through the Icelandic National Library in Reykjavik for information about the ash flow from Askja and which farms were affected by the ash. And you can see here from this map, this is a whole section of Iceland that was covered in ash. And at the time, it seemed like a very obscure and odd topic to research. But for a brief time last year, the whole world began paying attention to maps showing the ash flow from an Icelandic volcano. As you can see, the ash from Askja spread over a large area of the east of Iceland and was one of several factors that began Icelandic immigration to North America. In fact, 20% of the population immigrated over several decades at the end of the 19th century. And if you were here and saw the film last night, there's a whole section of the film about a volcanic eruption in the 1970s on an island in Iceland, and you really get a sense of the devastation that just that ash fall can have. My grandfather told the story to my mother, who told it to me, that he woke up one morning to a sky black as night and couldn't see his hand in front of his face. And that was the images that always haunted me and intrigued me. This is my grandfather, Oliver Björnsson, who I also never met. When I was young, I listened to my mother tell me all these stories about the Icelanders, but I didn't know any relatives growing up. I didn't know aunts, uncles, cousins, or grandparents. So they weren't real people to me. And, you know, just as many family stories, it just kind of went on in the background. And then in my mid-30s, my mother sent me my grandfather's memoir. And this was the real beginning of my falling in love with Iceland and the family history. His memoir was only a few pages long. He died before making much progress. But for the first time in my life, I felt that I could hear my grandfather's voice. I could see him as a boy with his parents, his brothers and sisters, journeying on horseback with their few possessions, fording glacial rivers under the midnight sun on their way to Canada. I was enthralled. Hesitantly, I asked my mother if there was anything more she might send me. There was. New packages began arriving in my mailbox every week. More family memoirs, letters, and genealogies. At this point, I had no idea I was going to write a novel about any of this. I just started reading and reading and reading. The Icelanders are great recorders of family history, and many of them write their own family histories and biographies. So I was very lucky in that I received this whole treasure trove from my mother of family documents. But she also started sending me her books. And the first book she gave me was called Icelandic River Saga. And next to my grandfather's memoir, this was the greatest influence of my writing the book. In fact, I never would have read the book Canada, including my family. Both he and his work became a great source of inspiration to me. It includes incredible details, photos, and documents from the lives of the immigrants. This morning I taught a memoir writing workshop, a life story writing, and I always like to put out a word to encourage people to write down their family stories, write down your life stories, and save the documents, because you never know who's going to become interested in the future in these things. If you've read my novel, you'll recognize that the character of Stefan in the novel is based on this real-life historian here, Nelson Gerard, who is now a dear friend of mine. And he was actually one of the first readers for the novel. I was very nervous about sending it to him. I'd only met him once at that point. And I hadn't told him that I based a character on him, but he took it very well. It's a sympathetic character. He said back about, I don't know, maybe 200 corrections to various words in Icelandic, which are impossible to spell, and has been a great friend to me. So my mother began slowly transferring to me her entire collection of Icelandic sagas, Eddas, mythology, history, literature, new and old. And one of the main reasons I really fell in love with Iceland is because of its literary history. This is a nation that was very poor and isolated for many centuries. They had no real art history, sculpture, architecture. Their only real cultural treasures are in the literature. And when you visit Iceland, you'll see no statues of military generals, because they've never had an army. But you'll see lots of statues of poets, and that was very appealing to me. This is the cover from one old book from the 13th century. It's called the Prose Edda. It was written by an ancestor of mine, Snorri Sturluson, who wrote down all the Norse mythology, even though Iceland was Christian by then. And that had a big influence on me and became woven throughout my book. I read many of the main Icelandic sagas, but for some reason Egil's saga is my favorite. This is a picture of Egil. He was a very ugly man. I was so fascinated by the connection between his adventures as a Viking and his poetry. He was what was called a warrior poet. He would cut off someone's head and then write a poem about it. I'd never heard of such a thing. Yet he was also capable of deep emotion in his poetry, especially concerning the death of his sons. And Egil's saga also became a theme in my book, exploring the connection between mood and creativity and loss. Well, by now I was completely transformed into an Icelandophile, and all of this material began to percolate in my mind in the shape of a novel. But family stories and books were no longer enough. I needed to start traveling to the places I would write about. I traveled to Iceland, Gimli, and Winnipeg, interviewing many old people, meeting my relatives for the first time, and visiting the places that would become locations in my novel. I made several trips to Iceland. The first in 1998, I traveled around the island for 10 days by myself, visiting glaciers, lava fields, and of course the different farms where my family lived in the east. I immediately fell in love with all the strange landscapes and geography I encountered. And this is actually on the Vatnajökull Glacier, which you can learn a bit about over here in the display that Ruth Ann and some others have worked on. I encourage you to look at these because they're filled with wonderful information. And this is where, right near here is where the volcano erupted a year ago and caused all that disaster for international air travel. Luckily, did not really cause that much hardship in Iceland itself because it's not a very populated region. And then on the right, I'm climbing through a lava field in the north of Iceland, which was talked about last night in the film. It's called Krakla. And, I have to say that was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. The Askja volcano that erupted in my grandfather's time is the one where the astronauts trained for the original moonwalks. And you can see why you really just feel like you're on another planet. And when you're walking on these lava fields, you have to wear gloves and boots because the lava is so sharp and still steaming in places. And my hiking boots ended up getting slashed across the front when I tripped. It was quite an adventure. One thing that I never imagined before I came to Iceland was connection I would have with my distant relatives. To my great surprise, my relatives in Iceland welcomed me with open hearts and so much Icelandic hospitality, feeding me delicious foods and touring me around the countryside. The women in this photo are descendants of my great-grandfather's brother, who chose not to immigrate and remained in Iceland. And it's very interesting. Both my grandmother and my grandfather's families came from Iceland. And of course, you know, many families, as in many countries, were split up by immigration. So in my great-grandfather's family, there were 6 siblings, and 4 left for North America, and 2 stayed behind in Iceland. And so I've met many of the descendants, or most of the relatives I know descend from those 2 who remained in Iceland. But one of the things that I encountered that I hadn't expected is that there's still this lingering feeling, kind of anti-immigrant feeling about the people who left in the 19th century. Now, not everybody felt that, but for example, this fellow that you see here in the middle of the photo, his name is Svein, or we would say Svein. He and his wife hosted me, having never met me for a month, when I went to study Icelandic in Reykjavik. And one of the first things that he told me, he was not a relation, of course his wife was that none of my people ever immigrated, he said proudly. And I realized, you know, we saw the film last night and how people fought to save their homes and dig them out from the ash. Many people, you know, there was a sense that the immigrants were traitors who left, that they abandoned their homeland, and that, you know, 1/5 of the population left. So people were worried about the survival of the island. As it turned out, the east of Iceland really couldn't support that many people. They were living in really terrible poverty. It was the poorest country in Europe. And it actually kind of lightened the burden and made it easier for the rest of the population to live. But there are still some lingering views, not among everybody, about this idea of people leaving Iceland. And when I was on my book tour, I did a talk with a number of academics where we had a forum about this topic, and it was right after the Icelandic collapse, and many people were talking about leaving Iceland again. And so all of these issues were coming up again. Should they stay and help and try to rebuild? Or what kind of future can the young people have there? And are they abandoning their country if they leave? And, you know, it was interesting that all those questions had come up again. But it was easy for me to find my relatives because the Icelanders are very obsessed with genealogy. They've been keeping track of their kinship lines since the settlement of Iceland in the 9th century. And I can trace myself back generation by generation for 1,000 years. And the first time I went to Iceland, they put my name in the database, and they traced me all the way back to that Viking warrior poet, Egil Skallagrimsson. And I was very excited about that. So they have this huge database, and one of the interesting projects that they've done with it is genetic research, because it's the only population in the world. You know, there's only 300,000 people in Iceland, and they have medical records going back over 100 years for the whole population. And they consented, after much national debate, to rent out their genealogical database to a company called Decode to do genetic research and to look for the causes of different diseases. And this database became available. You know, everybody's information was protected, you know, in terms of privacy, but they would rent this out to different biotech companies. And then Decode itself has done a lot of research and was one of the first companies to identify genes for many diseases. And interestingly, a few years ago, I developed thyroid cancer. And I mentioned to the doctor that my mother had thyroid cancer, and you know, that didn't seem at exactly the same age, and that didn't seem coincidental to me. And he said, oh, well, there's no genetic link. Well, 2 months later, Decode found the gene for thyroid cancer that my mother and I both had. So they've really found a lot of interesting things with that. Well, after my first trip to Iceland, I'd begun picking up the language, and one of the relatives I met encouraged me to come back and study Icelandic at the university. She forgot to tell me how hard the grammar is, or I would probably never have gone. To give you an idea of how complicated the Icelandic language is, there are 148 ways just to say the word the. And even people's names change depending on the grammar of the sentence. So if you were talking about Björn, you might say, you know, Björn is a farmer, but if you want to give Björn a book, you'd say, I gave the book to Bjössi. And sometimes a name doesn't even sound that much like what the original name is. So everything changes depending if you're sitting on the horse or walking toward the horse. There are so many different, even the numbers change and have male and female versions and different grammatical forms. And really, it's just too mind-boggling. It's considered the third most complicated language. So I don't feel too bad that I have not mastered it, but I call it my Alzheimer's prevention program. And I can try to learn it a bit. So I was hosted by the relatives that you saw in that photo, who some of them had never met me, but they put me up for an entire month, and I studied Icelandic full-time. And then on my third trip to Iceland, in 2001, I spent a month as a writer-in-residence at a place called Skriðjuklaustur. And this is an estate of the well-known, in Scandinavia, Icelandic writer named Gunnar Gunnarsson. And he specifically willed his estate to be a place for visiting writers, and especially for international writers to come. And the part of that building with the pointed roof was my wing of the building. It was like a writer's dream. It was just amazing. I wrote all the time. It was May, but it snowed a lot. This was what it looked like. And it was somewhat unusual, but I got into Reykjavik. All the domestic flights were canceled because of this blizzard. And when I arrived in the east of Iceland, the snow was up to my knees. And I could hardly go outside the whole month, I have to be honest. I mean, last year when we went, the weather was incredibly beautiful, probably from global warming, but we did not have a lot of bad weather. But in this month of May, the wind and the snow and the rain kept me inside this beautiful building, and I got more writing done in that 1 month than I had in the entire previous year. It also helped that my grandfather was born just across the river from this spot. And my great-grandparents, my great-grandfather was a minister at the church just across the road from here, so I had a lot of local family ties and history. And this photo is actually from my office that I had at the residency, filled with books, a number from my relatives, some of whom were well-known poets, which my mother used to tell me about and I scoffed at. But when I got to Iceland, I found out that they were indeed well-known poets. In fact, when I was there last year on the book tour, my father's uncle, Páll Ólafsson, somebody had just made a best-selling record based on the lyrics of his poetry that everybody, a CD that everybody was playing. And there was also a book that had been released of his love poetry. He was well known for his love poetry. So I was there sitting in this room every day surrounded by the work of my ancestors and various other Icelanders. And so it really, when I say it took 8 years to write the book, I was not writing full-time. I had a full-time job for most of that time. But a lot of it was all of this reading and research and traveling, which was just an incredible personal journey and quest that I went on. I did wonder a lot, was I ever going to finish? And I think my family wondered that a lot too, and my friends. At one point it was like, just don't ask. So my real quest became to finish this thing. I restructured it several times, and it took me a while to kind of come up with the story, which, as you can see, was not really autobiographical, although I wrote about themes that were very important to me. It had nothing to do with my own childhood in Long Island. I'd never been to Gimli before I started writing the book. So it was a long journey, and at times it was a struggle, and I wondered if I would ever finish. And then the publishing part of it, was really a fluke and happened very easily. And decided that that was just karma because the book took so long to write and was such a struggle. The first agent that I showed it to just loved it. And she said, you know, I can get you a deal with the New York publisher. And I said, wow, you know, my jaw just dropped. Because at that point, I'd hardly even thinking about publishing. All I could think about was just finishing. I didn't even care if I ever published it. I just wanted to finish it. And within, 2 months, we had a deal with Macmillan St. Martin's. However, she did have me cut out. She said she wanted me to cut down a little bit on the Norse mythology before we sent it out. At that point, the book was about 600 pages. It was in 2 manuscripts that she felt like, well, they're never going to look at this manuscript from an unknown writer. It's so huge. And so what she meant by cutting down on some of the Norse mythology was really just cutting out entire chapters from the book, most of which were historical parts that took place in the 19th century in Iceland. That was extremely painful. But she bribed me into doing it by saying, well, when you get an editor at the publishing house, you can always talk to him or her about putting that material back in. But I don't think we're going to get you to the door unless we can cut the size down on the book. So it was interesting. She picked out a lot of the earlier chapters that I'd worked on before I knew what the book was really about. And in the end, there was only 2 pages from all of that that I wanted to put back in, which I did sneak back in. But it was a painful time. The first day I felt like I was amputating one of my own limbs without anesthesia. When my husband came home, I was just in tears. And of course, once you change one thing in the book, it affects things all throughout the book. So, the book came out in the US and Canada in 2009, and then an Icelandic translation came out in 2010. And I only wish that my mother were alive for that. So 1 year ago exactly, in June, I went on a book tour to Iceland. And my tour was sponsored by Icelandair and by an organization in North America called the Icelandic National League. And really, it was the first time I've been able to afford to go back to Iceland in 9 years, because of course it took me a while to pay off, all my debt from all the travels to Iceland. And so it was very exciting to have a sponsored book tour. And my husband Oliver and I went for the first 2 weeks of June during the time of the midnight sun. So the formal part of the tour consisted of giving readings in different parts of Iceland. I ended up pretty much organizing this tour myself. My publisher turned out to be pretty flaky. And it also turned out they didn't really have book tours in Iceland. It just wasn't something that they did. And so it really ended up taking a huge amount of work on my part to organize this, but it definitely ended up being worth it. This was at my biggest event in Reykjavik. And then this was at a library in the north of Iceland, in Akureyri. And it was just a thrill to meet Icelandic readers. There was always someone like this old man who came up and thought we might be related, and we usually were. I met quite a lot of relatives on this trip. And I ended up getting a lot of coverage in the Icelandic media. I was thrilled because in this is their main paper, like their New York Times, and Oliver said my face was bigger than the volcanoes. And the headline here actually says, Jeg ust up Eitlingalaus. And that is not a common word, so I'm not used to pronouncing it, but it means I grew up relativeless, without relatives. And that to the Icelanders became the hook for this story, that I had grown up without really knowing any relatives, because to them, they know all of their relatives and they're very, very family oriented. So, and they have a great fondness, even though I talked about there's this lingering, some lingering sentiment about the people who left. I always have felt that I have just been treated with the most incredible excitement and interest and generosity by the Icelanders. As soon as they find out that I'm, half Icelandic, they're just all over it, and they're treating you like, your long-lost sister, practically. So, I don't know what it would be like to go to Iceland if I weren't connected like that. Although, as I was talking to somebody about last night. You know, the Icelanders are quite different than the other Scandinavian cultures. They have a very similar system of government and social safety net and the same liberal values. But I lived in Denmark in college, and in Denmark, which was actually Iceland's colonial ruler for about 600 years, the people are rather reserved. And the Icelanders, and the same is true of the Swedes and the Norwegians. And the Icelanders are very lively, and I think it's partly the original Celtic influence, because they brought a lot of Irish slaves with them when they settled Iceland, and I think they brought a lot of those lively storytelling traditions. But when you go to Iceland, they're much kind of livelier and more wild. They're the wild side of Scandinavia. This was an interview that I did with a big TV personality, and in fact, we were mobbed with people on all sides of school kids who not for me, but who recognized him. He did this interview in front of the Leif Erikson statue that's in Reykjavik. The most emotional part was not the publicity, though, or even doing the readings, but being reunited with friends and relatives after 9 years. This was a very dear relative and friend of mine named Johanna, who I met by complete accident on my first trip to Iceland. I was at a bed and breakfast at a farm. They don't have a lot of hotels in Iceland, so a lot of times you stay on farms. I was staying on a farm, and the old woman, who didn't speak English that well, as soon as I explained that I was connected to, this poet, Palt Olafsson, so she was calling everybody and, getting things organized for me to visit the farm there. And she said, well, there's 2 other women staying here, and they're also descended from Palt and Jon Olafsson. And one is Canadian and one is Icelandic. And it was true. And they came home that evening, and we stayed up till 2 in the morning, and one of them was Johanna, and another was a woman from Canada. And Johanna was a nurse before she retired, and she'd been to the U.S. and looked up many relatives. So just as we, quote, Western Icelanders go back to Iceland to look for relatives, there's many Icelanders who are still coming here to these communities and tracking people down and trying to find them, because they feel this loss of their family tree. They want to have it complete, even though these might be 5th cousins. This is me meeting my Icelandic publisher for the first time. And, even though he's a publisher, this is a very typical Icelandic living room, just filled with books. And even when you go into the farmhouses, they're just filled with books. This is the hardcover version of my book, and this was a photo of me at the glacial lagoon. We were just visiting, and I thought, we should take a photograph with me with the book. Most of the time, we stayed with friends and relatives who showed typical Icelandic generosity, and we ate a lot of wonderful food on this trip, like this homemade Icelandic brown bread, which is boiled in a milk carton for a day. And it is so delicious. I do have the recipe, and I'm going to try it. In the north, our host, whose name was Kiddig, he went fishing that day, and when we arrived, he had fresh fish that he caught, and he made fish cakes for us using his mother's recipe. The volcano had stopped erupting just a few days before we left on our trip. In one way, it was a relief, because we knew our flight wouldn't be disrupted, but it was also a disappointment not to see the eruption itself. But we saw plenty of evidence of the eruption, and you can see here how green it is, and then just suddenly those dark mountains are where the ash fell. And again, this same scene of this had all been green is now covered with ash. This is the ring road that goes around Iceland, which if you read in my book, Birdie and Freya Take a Trip on the Ring Road. There really aren't roads that go through the middle of Iceland. 90% of it is uninhabitable and untraversable unless you're in serious four-wheel drive vehicles that can drive through rivers, if you were here and saw the film last night. But this is on the ring road, and there was quite a lot of volcanic ash still whipping around on the road. And it made me really think about what it was like for my grandfather's family to live for a whole year in that land of ashfall before they decided to immigrate. Well, you've probably heard about Iceland's terrible economic crisis, which they call the kreppa. I talked to everyone we met throughout the trip about the impact of the economic crisis. and it seemed that everyone had been affected in one way or another. We saw a lot of evidence. There were a lot of half-finished buildings. Iceland had been in this big bubble boom, and there was so much construction going on, and there were whole, housing developments and buildings that were just half-finished and abandoned. As well as, for example, the reason that our host Kitty was able to spend the day fishing was because he had lost his job running a mental health clinic in Akureyri. Unfortunately, they decided that just at the time when everybody was losing their jobs, that was the time to close the mental health clinic because of the loss of money that happened in the government. So quite a number of my relatives had either lost jobs or had to take on other people's jobs who had lost jobs in addition to their own. This graffiti in Reykjavik reflects the anger that many people feel toward the bankers who they believe stole their money. But Iceland has often faced hard times, from volcanic disaster to being under colonial rule for centuries, terrible plagues and famines. And there were times when the population of the island almost died out entirely. And in fact, that poet uncle that I mentioned, Half Olafsson from the 19th century, his brother Jón was a poet and an editor and a nationalist and was fighting for independence. And at one point, before Oscar erupted, he just decided they were never going to get their independence and they were just living in terrible poverty, and they should relocate the entire population of Iceland to Alaska. And he wrote a petition to President Ulysses S. Grant, and the U.S. was trying to settle Alaska at that time. So Jón and my grandfather's brother and a number of my other family members and Icelanders went on this scouting trip to Alaska, although nothing ever ended up coming of it, and then they went to Canada instead. But his idea was that they should just give up on Iceland and transport the whole population over to North America. He was a bit of a wild character. He ended up in Canada and then back in Iceland himself and continued fighting for independence. But my point there is, that there were times when Iceland almost died out completely. And so even though the Icelanders are going through a very hard time now with the economic collapse, I believe that they're going to survive this difficult period. They have a very strong spirit. And that's something that I like to think that I've inherited, is some of that resilient Icelandic spirit. It gives me a lot of strength and inspiration. So now, in the time we have remaining, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have about Iceland or book writing or anything else.
Who's that on the screen right now?
Oh, that's my mother and my grandmother, who were identified earlier. You might not have seen them. My grandmother is in, if you read my book, what is called the Fjallkonat. It's each year. What I love about this festival is it's a yearly festival that takes place in Icelandic communities around the country, but was started in Gimli. And an older woman is chosen to represent the spirit of the community, somebody who's contributed a lot. So at the first couple of years, it was kind of an Icelandic beauty queen thing, but then they got into this thing of honoring. So this was, earlier on when the women were younger. Now they're really usually women in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. This was my grandmother when she was 42. So she was not normally wearing that traditional dress in Winnipeg in the 1930s, but this is still the dress that they wear if you go to the festival in Gimli, which still goes on every year.
How widely is the book been distributed in the U.S. or Canada?
Well, pretty widely. I mean, when it came out, it was a bestseller in the Bay Area, and it certainly was in all the bookstores and everything like that. It never took off. I mean, it sold well, but it didn't become a national bestseller or anything. I found it a bit of a struggle to get people interested in Iceland. I mean, just the name Iceland is daunting for a lot of people. But even since my book has come out, there's become more awareness, I think, and interest of Iceland. When I started my book, really, especially in America, just nobody knew anything about Iceland, and it was one of the things that really motivated me to write the book, because I felt it was this obscure story of immigrants that nobody really knew about.
And what about possibly a movie?
You know, I have been thinking about that recently. I've just identified an Icelandic film director in LA who I'm going to approach about film rights, because if I could sell the film rights, I could take time off from my job and really get another book written. The problem is that it's extremely difficult to film anything in Iceland because of the constant wind and the weather conditions. So it just becomes this boondoggle if you're trying to do a film project there. It's just very, very, very difficult. And if you saw the film about Iceland last night, Rick Ray arrives in Iceland and there's like 70 days of rain. And he doesn't even get to travel around the island for 2 months. So you can imagine what it's like when you're in this whipping wind, plus all the disasters that seem to be happening. So it would be quite an undertaking for somebody.
You could film it in Oregon. We have lots of lava fields.
That's
There's a
true.
volcano in Washington that went off recently.
That's true. Somebody that could probably be faked.
And the mountains in Alaska look quite similar.
Yeah.
As the velvet green that goes on and then stops suddenly.
Well, you know, that's a good point. I mean, it would be heartbreaking to me, though, not to have it actually be filmed in Iceland. But it might make it more feasible,
Yes.
because Iceland has got pretty much the worst weather in the world. And I was telling my husband before we went, you know, like, you just have to be prepared that it's going to rain every day, and it's going to be cold and windy. And it was sunny the whole time. I keep teasing him that he didn't really go to Iceland. And the funniest sight was seeing all these pale-skinned Icelanders who were just rushing out into this rare sun and getting so sunburned.
Yeah, your choice of the character Birdie and the main character with the and you may have talked about this earlier, but with the bipolar disorder, I thought that was so wonderful how you were able to put yourself inside the heads of these people who suffered with this disability, and I was just that to me was just as enthralling as the wonderful sense of the Icelandic culture, the way that you took these two things and put them together.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very important part of the book to me, really, and it was not something that I set out to do. In fact, when I started, I had Birdie as an alcoholic, because my mother had been raised by an alcoholic Icelander, and Iceland does have an alcohol problem, so it seemed very typical to me. But when I told my mother that, she said, "Oh, honey, you can't do that. That will give people a terrible impression of the Icelanders." Well, that wasn't why I changed it, of course. And I said, "Mom, you know, characters have to have problems or no one's going to be interested in them." But instead, the character evolved to have bipolar disorder, which my mother had actually turned out to have. And it wasn't really something that I intended to write about, but it was just something that happened. And then I did a lot of research into that as well and learned a lot about that. Kay Jamison is a psychiatrist and author of a number of books on bipolar disorder and suffers from it herself. And she wrote a book called Touched by Fire, and she has explored the connection between bipolar disorder and creativity, which is very interesting, and traces a number of very well-known writers who have had this bipolar disorder, which luckily I did not inherit. But so that was also something that informed me a lot in developing the character of Birdie.
And then I thought it was interesting that last night in the film we talked about the lack of light and how that affected people's psyches. And in your main character is actually too much light. That's her problem.
Yes, yeah. And that was just something that I came up with that I thought might happen. And then I had to research it to see, well, is that true? Could that happen? And it is true that people who have bipolar disorder and people who have seasonal affective disorder can also be affected and develop mania from the long, light-filled days. But I'm one of those people who suffers in the dark, you know? I have to live in a place that's sunny. Some Icelanders have the gene. They found that the Icelandic Canadians are very resistant genetically to seasonal disorder, but I'm not one of them. I have to have a light box in the winter.
So what is the percentage of the immigration? Was most of it Danish or?
Which,
You said that a lot of it was Scandinavian.
the original settlement of Iceland?
Yeah, the early.
So when Iceland was settled in the 9th century, it was settled mainly by Norwegian Vikings, who were being crowded out of Norway by a king. You know, at that time, kings there were many kings in European countries. They weren't all nation states. But this king was trying to consolidate his rule over everybody. And so the other people who had power decided to leave. There were various things going on, the Christianization of Norway as well. So a group of them went to Iceland, and it was virtually uninhabited, and it had always been uninhabited. There were a few Irish monks living there. So this was in the year 874 is the year that they usually attribute to the settlement of Iceland. And they stopped off along the way in Ireland and took a lot of women as Irish slaves. So most Icelandic women today, our DNA is 40 to 60% Celtic, because that was how many Irish slaves that they brought with them. And they stopped off in the Orkneys and the Shetland Islands and brought people from there and left some of their people there. And so that was how the original settlement happened, was from Norway. And they were independent from Norway. The golden age of Iceland was the first couple of hundred years, where they developed their own parliament, the first running democracy, longest running democracy in the world, and their own legal system. But eventually they didn't have a way to enforce it because they didn't have an executive power. And they had so much civil strife that they ended up relinquishing control to Norway and then ultimately to Denmark. So they were under colonial rule in Denmark for about 600 years until 1945. They got their independence. And they really lived in terrible poverty. The Danes had a very cruel trade monopoly. And as I mentioned before, it was the poorest country in Europe.
I've been to Norway and they had a lot of needlepoint work that they did. Did they do the same thing?
I have a lot of things from my mother's aunt who did needlepoint and also all the Icelandic sweaters and things that she would send us when we were kids. That, you know, continues among the descendants as well.
Something wrong with sheep.
Yeah, I mean, you gotta do something in all those long winter nights. And what they would do was they would sit around, and the whole household would gather in the farm. It was called the baðstofa, and that was the room that they would be in together. And it was known as the kvöldvaka, which means evening wake. And they would be there, you know, during all the time that it was dark in the winter. And all the members of the household, as well as the workers in the household, would be, you know, mending fishing nets and spinning wool and doing all the chores while one person each night would do the reading. And that was how Iceland ended up with this incredibly high literacy rate, even though they really had no schools practically. Even in the 19th century, they had a 100% literacy rate because that's what they ended up doing during those long, dark winters. Was reading aloud from the Bible and the sagas and the poetry. Poetry is very big in Iceland, or was traditionally, certainly. And a lot of people write poetry. I was very charmed when I first went there, and in the newspaper, the tradition in all the obituaries is, you know, people write in pieces about their family, but they also write memorial poems. So it's a lot of this feeling that it's not like here where poetry and writing is reserved for only the special writers who become celebrities. You know, it's really part of everyday life. And there's this whole tradition of farmer poets, which is what my grandfather's uncle was. These were people who, you know, worked very, very long hours as farmers, but were composing poetry and writing and publishing books of poetry. And there were also farmer poets who ended up in Manitoba and North Dakota, and who have become favorite poets of the Icelanders. When I was in North Dakota in the Icelandic community last summer, there were whole field trips of Icelanders who were coming to visit the gravestone of this poet Stefferson, who'd been born in Iceland but immigrated to North Dakota in the 19th century. Is very beloved. And the Icelanders come from Iceland and they stand around his gravesite in this remote area of North Dakota on the plains, and they drink and do toast to him. And, those are their heroes. Well,
my ancestry is Hungarian. All my ancestors. My parents even. I'm the first one here. So my parents didn't even speak English. When I was a child, I had to learn it in school. And all the things you say about the language is similar to Hungarian. There's no prepositions in that language either. We tack them onto the ends of the nouns. So,
I think Hungarian is also a very complex
that's
language.
supposed to be the hardest language to learn. That's what I've been told. You said Icelandic was number 3.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure, I should remember what the first two are, but one of them is Chinese or Japanese.
Hungarian is right up there.
I'm sure.
That was my first language. Now, as I understand it, fully, I had to learn English. I thought that was tough.
Yeah.
Hungarian is absolutely phonetic. And it looks like Icelandic is too. Every letter that's in the word, you say.
Yes, Icelandic is actually easy, I find easy to pronounce once you learn the rules. If it weren't for the crazy grammar. And, English used to have the same crazy grammar. They were very, very closely related. And in fact, Icelandic poets were in English courts and Scandinavian courts. They had a special calling as the court skalds. The languages were fairly intelligible. But what happened was that over time, as many people have tried to learn English, they've simplified the grammar. So English grammatically has become the most simple of all the Germanic languages, although our spelling is so insanely complicated that it makes it really hard for people to learn it in another way. Yeah.
Learning the spelling.
Yeah.
Hungarian, you have to know how to spell.
Yeah, in Iceland,
Each letter.
it's not idiosyncratic. Once you learn the rules, you can spell it, you can pronounce it, and if you can remember which of the 148 ways to say the, you're a business.
There's other similarities. The poets, I've been in Budapest, well, that's where all my family is now. All the American ones have died, so my parents and aunts and uncles on this side of the pond are gone. So they're all in Hungary, and when I go back there, they have statues of poets, just like your He was my father's favorite poet, and I have all his books. And there's a statue of him. There's a statue of writers. Military people though too, but that is so similar. A lot of things are similar. I've always wanted to go to Iceland since I was little. Since we studied it in 3rd grade, I wanted to go there. And now I know why. I think there's this affinity to the kind of people and everything.
There may be. I hope that you get there and see if you find that affinity.
Well, I'm planning a trip now.
Oh, really?
Friend circle travel up there.
But what?
Friend circle travel. It's a travel
Okay.
agency for older people. And after our Africa trip, which is next May, we're going to Iceland.
Oh, fabulous. I encourage everybody to go, and it's a cheap time to go. Last trip was the first time I could ever afford to eat in an Icelandic restaurant. I mean, it used to be the prices were just so astronomical, but because of the economic collapse, it's actually affordable now. And it's much easier to get to these crazy wild landscapes as well.
You mentioned that you possibly could be writing another book. Can you get an idea of what you're thinking about?
Well, I have two things that I'm working on. I really can't decide between them, but one of them is an historical Icelandic novel, partly because I had to give up all that material. And I really want to write more about the time period of the immigration, both in Iceland and North America. So that's one thing. But then I also got interested, in this book, there's a quest that Freya goes on to find a child that her Aunt Bertie gave up for adoption, an enclosed adoption. And that got me interested in the whole issue of adoption. And so I'm also working on a book, the immigrant book is more in my mind, but I've actually actually started researching and writing this other book, which takes place in a maternity home in the US. It covers a whole period of time when there were these blind adoptions that happened, and the kind of impact that it has on the women and children's and people's lives years later as they try to find each other. Well, thank you all very much.
So how many of you are ready to find a way to get to Iceland? It was interesting last night because as she talked about the film, and you know, he's documenting this 70 days of rain, and you think, why would anybody go there? But by the end of the film, there were a lot of people saying, well, I want to go.
And they always say in Iceland, if you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes.
It doesn't rain
All
just
day. It's just blowing it.
I did want to tell you that that film from last night will be available through the county library for checkout as soon as we can get it in the system, and it is called Letters Home from Iceland. The posters, if you don't get a chance to see them tonight, will be in the county library for the next few weeks. So they're going to have them up there again. And there are books about Iceland and Icelandic mysteries that she got me started on. And I was thinking last night, she told the names of these authors. I want you to say it again.
Okay. Well, the one I think you're thinking of is, his name is Arnaldur, which is spelled like
Oh,
Arnaldur.
no, I want you to just say it.
Okay.
I don't want you to spell it.
Okay. Arnaldur Indriðason.
Would you have any idea where to look?
And the other, and the other one is Yrsa Sigurdardóttir.
So I have a hint for you. The one, and I love mysteries, the one that she first mentioned has a book called Jar City. J-A-R-C-I-T-Y. You can remember that. So look up the title Jar City, and that's the author.
He's a very gloomy detective, and even though there's really no crime in Iceland, there are these two writers who are doing wonderfully well. I'm so pleased about who are writing murder mysteries in Iceland. It's quite a stretch.
And we find the food so interesting. Those of you who watch Anthony Bourdain, who is a travel writer, I understand that, tests food everywhere in the world. And he had a list of the 10 worst foods he has ever eaten. And number 2 was this specific shark, fermented shark. And there's a picture of it.
This is a wonderful display.
On this poster. So that and the sheep's head, boiled sheep's head, and some other things. It's been so interesting researching this far. Christina, thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
been fascinating. So if you have questions, you can ask her, and you know what, let's put her up here. She will autograph books from here. Yes. So we'll put this down and I'll let you hold that chair. In fact, let's just bring it to her here. I'll